I want to mention that, not that I'm trying to throw stones, Jericho did do a great job of that in 1997 and specifically in 1998. Disco's doing it here in 96. And believe it or not, for several months, he disappeared in 1997. Here's what the Observer said. During the show, Jacqueline challenged any male wrestler. Best bet is Disco Inferno, who's about the only guy who can get away with it. Now, the Observer the next week would say Disco was fired on March the 4th when he refused to do a program, which would have ended with him putting over Jacqueline in the singles match at Uncensored. The vast majority of the wrestlers were totally in support of Disco on that one and felt that putting over a woman in a singles match was a career killer. Wade Keller added a little more color here, and he says that Disco refused to do so and was fired as a result. There was an exchange of heated words between Disco and management. Bischoff fired him for quote unquote breach of contract since he refused to do what he was told. The speculation already is that Disco will show up as Honky Tonk Man's new find. Honky hinted he'd be producing a clone of himself to pick up the Intercontinental title where he left off. Of course, we know Honky winds up taking over Billy Gunn for a little bit and calling him Rockabilly. That was a miss, but eventually we get the New Age Outlaws. This is something that I remember reading about maybe at the height of the internet wrestling community's growth period in 1997. What do you remember? What really happened with Disco refusing to put over Miss Jackie? And were there really heated words? Were the wrestlers really behind Disco? What can you tell us about this?
I don't know how the locker room felt. I would imagine they were supportive. I don't think I'd be surprised if they weren't. Heated words, I don't remember if they were heated or not. I think Glenn's not he didn't yell. He would tell you how he felt, but he was professional about it. He stood his ground, and so did I. So yeah, I fired him. I've always look, when you get hired, to me, my perspective, when you get hired as a talent, your job is to perform to the best of your abilities, the creative that is designed, approved, and then given to you to go out and perform. I never understood. Now, I understand people having issues with things, and if you want to talk about it, if there's a way to compromise, if perhaps somebody just needs to understand the big picture, no problem with any of that. In fact, I think the more of that, the better, because it enables a talent to really understand and see the big picture as opposed to just going out and doing something for one night. And I think you get a much better performance long-term out of your talent if they see the bigger picture and at least understand why. But once I go through the explanation and explain the why of it, that's it. Your job is to do what you've been asked to do. Compromise, sure. Ways to make it a little easier, sure. Ways to make it better, absolutely. Bring it on. But when somebody just says, no, I can't do that, I won't do that, that's a different conversation. And that's the conversation we had. Glenn was determined he wasn't going to do what I had asked him to do, and I was determined not to let it slide. So yeah, I terminated him. Because it's a slippery slope, Connor. What if you don't? What if Disco comes to me, and no offense to Glenn Gilberti at all, because I like Glenn and have respect for Glenn. But Glenn was not Hulk Hogan. Glenn was not Ric Flair. Right? Glenn was a new kid on the block who was getting an opportunity. And if when given creative that everybody was involved in, not just me, I didn't create it, Kevin Sullivan, whoever else was involved in it, we give that to Disco and he says, no, I won't do that. If I would have let that slide, how do you think the other 102 people that work for me as talent are going to respond the next time they see something that for whatever reason they just don't like? That's the leadership part. When you have to make tough decisions, I didn't want to fire Glenn. I like Glenn. I thought Glenn was a great performer, but you just can't let that one slide. That's a no-fly zone. When someone says, no, I understand it. I know why you're doing it, but I don't want to. That's the end of that conversation.
What did Jackie think about all this?
Jackie was quiet. I'm sure she talked to Kevin because her and Kevin were pretty close. Kevin is the one that I think brought her in, and he was very, very supportive of her. But Jackie was very quiet. I mean, we spoke casually, in a friendly way as we pass each other or see each other at television, but I never really had a conversation with her about this.
It feels like she was way ahead of her time. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah. And she was a pro. She was tough, 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 but she was also really a pro, soft spoken, very professional. I enjoyed working with her.
I should mention, and here's where, as a friend of mine says, which is especially appropriate for me, you can tell with the way I sound. Here's where the snot thickens on this whole Disco Jackie story. Do you know their history? You may not even know this.
Nope.
Disco, the real life Glenn Gilberti's first break in wrestling was on Memphis TV 4 years prior, where he channeled his inner Andy Kaufman and proclaimed himself to be the intergender champion. And he feuded with Miss Jackie in Memphis. So maybe
so somebody stole that idea.
they had worked together. They had done it before. They were familiar with each other. And my only question is, the only thing that makes sense, because I've never asked Glenn about this. Do you think he dug his heels in because, hey, Memphis TV is one thing. This is national TV. This is, at that point in 1997, the biggest promotion in the world. I don't mind doing it in the Memphis market for the Memphis people to see on TV. Okay. But the biggest wrestling company in the world, bigger than the WWF at this point, I don't know if I want to become known as that guy. Knowing now that they had done it before, does that change your opinion on anything?
Not at all. In fact, if anything, if I would have known that, I would have been more insistent upon it, because I know that since they had worked together previously, the quality of the match was probably going to be pretty good.
Positioning on the card, listen, I know that people are going to throw rocks at you after this, because I'm sure that somebody stroked that old Fu Manchu once upon a time and says, doesn't work for me, brother. Or he hits you with one of the famed, and then what? And where do we go from there? What about next week? But when Disco refuses to do a job, she's shown the door. Is this production has its privileges? Like, the show can carry on. We can live without a Disco Inferno. But if I don't draw the line right now and make an example out of someone, and I know that's a terrible way to talk, but sometimes when you are concerned that, hey, are Sean Waltman and Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, are they getting too far out over their skis? Do we have any dissension in the locker room? Are people being lax about the rules and puffing their chest out just a little bit and straying away from the company vision? I need to tighten the reins. I don't want to fire one of those guys. I need them. That's a big story. Maybe I can make an example out of this guy and business still be here the next day. Does that even cross your mind in that era, or are you not thinking that way?
No. I was really, I understand why you would ask the question and why people would ask it as well. Kind of a big difference. One is Hulk did have creative control. So if Hulk had started stroking his Fu Manchu and said it didn't work for me, brother, then that's a different conversation under those circumstances. Keep in mind, he never did that until the Sting thing at Starrcade. But I would have had, to your point, I would have had to treat that differently. But I didn't think about it within the context of Scott Hall or Sean Waltman or anybody else. I did, as I said to you a few moments ago, recognize that if I let Glenn Gilberti have creative control after he'd been with the company for 12 months or whatever it was, then I would completely lose control of the rest of the locker room. That I did consider. I didn't even consider it very long. It's not like I knew it. I didn't have to think about it. So I understand why you would ask the question, but it's not really applicable here. This was a young talent. We wanted to do something. It was Kevin Sullivan's creative, not mine. He had a reason for doing it, and the talent said no. There's not a whole lot more to think about it. Yes, I made an example out of him. I guess you could look at it that way, just like I made out of Honky Tonk when he refused to do something, or I would have made out of anybody else who refused to do something. They just flat out said no. After the explanation was there, after the bigger picture conversation was there, and if they still refuse to do it, then there's nothing really to talk about. What are you going to do?
Well, I got to ask you about this story because it came up in both the Observer and the Torch. The Observer came out on March 31st. The Torch came out on April 5th. Here's what Wade said. Disco Inferno has a no-compete clause that lasts well into the summer, even though he was fired. So he probably is unable to sign with the WWF for now. Bischoff told Disco when he fired him that he would never get another job that paid him 80 grand a year.
I don't think I did, but maybe. First of all, was I paying him 80 grand a year?
I just love the idea that you're like, not only are you fired, I want you to know you'll never have it as good as you had it right here, you dumbass.
I may have said that or implied it. Could have said it. But 80 grand? I think I was paying him more than 80 grand a year. 75 grand was like power plant money. That was pretty cheap back then, but I think I paid him more than that.
According to the payroll data that has been compiled over the years by Chris Harrington and David Bixenspan, he's close to, I think, what you were paying him that year. We know eventually he's going to come back in September, but man, I'm sure he was thinking as he's working independence and not able to go work for the WWF, I need to save some money.